everybody, the Book Dad here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that made me who I am. We're going to be talking about those foundational pieces of literature, those books that I read from when I was a young age all the way through my teenage years, my 20s and 30s, all the way even till today. The things that were important to me, that sparked something interesting, that caused me to love reading even more. It's going to be a little bit of a journey through history. I hope you'll enjoy as you follow me through my life of reading. But before we start, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of you that have watched my first booktube video, liked and subscribed, and made such nice comments welcoming me to the booktube community. You guys are great. I hope you'll continue watching, and for all of those that are new to the channel and watching this for the first time, hey, welcome. I hope you'll enjoy it, and here we go. All right, so we're going to take a little trip back in history, back to a magical, mystical time, a time known as the 1980s. That's right. The very first book that I'm going to talk about is something that was gifted to me as a young boy. I hinted at this in my first video and told about this story, but when I was young, my grandmother came and visited us. Now, we didn't get to see her and my grandpa very often because we lived far away from them. But one time she came and visited, and she brought with her a book that she wanted to give to me. Now, she was a great grandma. She was so nice, the kind of grandma anybody would love to have. And she brought me this book, and it was kind of funny because she's like, now, I want you to not be scared about this because the cover is a little scary, but don't worry, it's a good book, and I think you'll really like it. Well, turns out she was right, because the first book I'm going to talk about is The Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander, book one in the Prydain Chronicles. Now, this is the exact copy that my grandma gave me when I was young. And you can see what she's talking about with the skull-headed rider with the antlers looking all scary on his black horse. I was hooked just from the picture. And I wanted to know, what the heck was this guy? What is he doing? Like, what is this book going to be about? Well, I was hooked from the beginning, like I said. It was a story of adventure, of fantasy, the first fantasy book that I ever read. It's about a young farm boy who is an assistant pig keeper. He's not even the full-time pig keeper. He's only the assistant pig keeper. But nevertheless, that pig escapes, runs away, and thus starts the journey and the adventure of young Taran as he goes throughout Prydain, acquiring new companions and friends, fighting evil, and having all kinds of amazing adventures. This really spoke to me as a kid. I was so interested in those adventures. In the Prydain series, there are 5 books. So following this one, you have The Black Cauldron, The Castle of Lyr, Taran Wanderer, and The High King. These books were written back in the 1960s, so it came just a little bit after The Lord of the Rings. So it's actually quite old. Now, this is a middle grade series, so I don't know, for people reading it as an adult for the first time what you might think. It's going to probably seem a little bit childish, but for me, nothing can beat that nostalgia. That nostalgia rush is something else. And every time I read this, I still feel those feelings of being a little boy and discovering fantasy for the first time. And I've gotten to read this book and the whole series to my kids. And hey, it stands up to modern sensibilities. They loved it. They thought it was great. So, hey, for all you parents out there that want something interesting and cool to read to your kids, I suggest the Prydain Chronicles. Now, moving on from there, not that far into the future, but we're still in the 80s, I came across a book that turned out to be my favorite book possibly of all time. Now, I saw the movie first, and I'm sure many of you have, but this is The Never-Ending Story. Now, few books ignited my passion for reading as a kid as much as this one did. This was amazing to me. The book itself is the story of young Bastian who steals the Never-Ending Story, runs up to his school attic, and begins to read it, following the adventures of young Atreyu in the land of Fantastica. Yeah, that's right. It's not Fantasia like in the movie. In the book, it's Fantastica. But chalk that up to the German translation to English. This was originally written in German, and some of the words changed between the movie and the book. But this book is great. It has colored ink that I thought was amazing at the time. And even since then, I haven't seen that many books that use ink like that. It starts with red ink and then goes into green when he transitions from the real world to Fantastica, and then back and forth. So you know where you are just based on the color of the ink. Each chapter starts with a letter of the alphabet, A through Z, and has a beautiful picture drawn there to symbolize what's going on in that chapter. Something that I'd never seen before in books. So the whole thing just caught my imagination like fire. And I probably checked this book out a dozen or more times from my local library. Back then in the 80s, when you check a book out from the library, they'd have little library cards that they'd pull out of it and stamp it to show that you had checked it out. And then when you brought it back, they'd put that card back in, and that thing had my name on it, like row after row after row. The librarians were probably like, who is this kid? Why doesn't his parents just buy him that book? But anyways, that's how I read it back then. Now, of course, I've got this copy, but now I have this amazing Never-Ending Story Folio Society copy that Bookwife gave me for my birthday a couple years ago. It is beautiful and the showpiece of my whole shelf. But yeah, The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. It's one that I recommend for anybody. And again, this is another one that I read to my kids and they loved it. All right, now moving forward a little bit, we're getting into an era known as the 1990s. I'm beginning to listen to groups like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains on the radio, Smashing Pumpkins. But in the middle school where I was going, there began to be something that I noticed as I walked through the hallways and went to my classes. All the young boys in the middle school started to have this series of books. I didn't know what it was. I would see red books, blue books, green books, a certain logo across them that looked really cool. Well, turns out they were all reading at the same time Dragonlance. This was so popular in my middle school. I didn't know what it was at first, but like I said, I saw everybody reading it and carrying it around in their backpacks, and I was like, I have got to get this book. Like, each cover has a new dragon on it and this beautiful artwork. This, of course, is written by the team of Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, and is separated into different volumes. And the first series is called Chronicles, Dragonlance Chronicles, and from there it goes on to Legends, and each one has 3 volumes. But from there it exploded into probably, I'm guessing, hundreds of books at this point. But this was so cool because while I had started reading fantasy, like I said, with Lloyd Alexander and The Never-Ending Story, which were both awesome, but, you know, books for children, now with the Dragonlance books, it's getting into a little more young adult territory, like a little more serious. There's a lot more violence and fighting and fun stuff going on. Dragons, magic, all kinds of adventures, new races of people, new creatures, and I ate these up. They were so cool. And also at this time is when I'm beginning to start to make money myself. I'm not making a ton of money, obviously. I hadn't been able to buy books prior to that. I was just a little kid, right? But with Dragonlance, I'm starting to make some allowance money. I'm starting to mow lawns and get a little bit of money for that. And every single cent that I made went towards buying new Dragonlance books. Every time I'd go to the little bookstore there, I'd buy a new paperback copy of the Dragonlance. And this was the beginning of my collecting of books, something that became super important to me, and especially right now where I can't buy enough books. But the cool thing was they had this logo, the Dragonlance logo, on the side of the book. And, you know, I've got my original copies of the Chronicles and Legends here, but there were so many more, and I just have them all lined up on my bookshelf as a kid with that Dragonlance logo. There was the Tales, the Heroes, all different kinds of series. So I loved them. And that was definitely a foundational fantasy book for me that got me excited to read more. All right, the next thing, still in middle school now, but there was a book that had been around for a while. This came out in the late 70s. I didn't find out about it until the 90s when I was in middle school. But this is important because this was the fattest book that I had ever read up to that point in my life. What I'm talking about is The Sword of Shinara by Terry Brooks. Now, I know from watching BookTube there's a bit of a controversy as a Shinara. I always called it Shinara. That's what I'm going to call it. So sorry if it's wrong. I can't change now. It's too late. All right. So The Sword of Shinara by Terry Brooks. This was a chunker for middle school book dad. Now, so this was a cool book because up to that point, this was the biggest book I had ever read at over 700 pages. Now, of course, now I've been able to expand my horizons a little bit, and I've gone beyond the 1,000-page book mark. Back then, this was the biggest thing, and it was like a status symbol for me. Now, granted, at the time, it's a bit of a nerdy status symbol. It didn't really get me a lot of friends back then necessarily, but I thought it was cool. The interesting thing about this series is I never went past book one. I only read this one. I read it a couple of times. I loved it so much. But the other thing too is I had never read or barely even heard about The Lord of the Rings by the time that I read this in middle school. So I had no previous experience about the plot of The Lord of the Rings, which gave me an awful lot of leeway to love this book. Now, all of you that have read both, or at least have read The Lord of the Rings, and now everybody has, of course, seen the movies, you will be very suspicious about the plotting of The Sword of Shinara. It's very similar to The Lord of the Rings. Now, is that bad? I don't know. It's still well written. While it borrows heavily from the story and plotting of The Lord of the Rings, it still has some interesting and unique elements. But what is important in this series is if you continue on to books 2 and 3, the Elf Stones of Shannara and the Wish Song of Shannara, then you really get into some cool, unique, and new territory where Terry Brooks really branches out and then does his own thing. I feel like back then and this time, people just sort of had to copy the strategy of The Lord of the Rings, which was the most, of course, foundational and amazing book of all time in the fantasy genre. And so everybody was sort of making little one-offs of The Lord of the Rings. So I think maybe that's what Terry Brooks did in the late 70s. But from there, of course, now Shannara has dozens of books in that series. And there's still a lot that I haven't read in there and that I am interested to continue reading. But the other thing with Terry Brooks, though, like I said, I only read the first book in the Shannara series, but I did move on and read a bunch of Terry Brooks's other series, The Magic Kingdom of Landover. Now, I never hear anybody talking about this book on BookTube. It's great. Like, the first book in the series is called Magic Kingdom for Sale, Sold. Interesting title. Thought it was interesting back then, and I think it still is. But this book series, it's like a portal fantasy where a man buys a magic kingdom in a special catalog for $1 million. And then turns out it's real. He goes there and becomes the ruler of this magical kingdom and then has to deal with all of the problems that are there and learns that things like dragons, witches, gnomes, like wizards are all real. And it's very interesting. It's funny. And, you know, Terry Brooks has a very interesting way of writing. And this Magic Kingdom of Landover series was also really fun. And I recommend it to anybody that's interested in old school fantasy. Now, moving on a few years, in the early 90s, there was a movie that came out that blew everybody's mind. It was amazing. And I saw it in the theater, and I'm talking about Jurassic Park. I saw this movie not knowing anything else about it other than it was just a movie about dinosaurs, and it was crazy. Now, after watching the movie, I learned it was based on a book. So I went and got the book Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Now, this is the next book in my history of reading that really influenced what I like. This is the beginning of my love of the techno thriller. Michael Crichton, of course, is the king of the techno thriller, but the torch has been handed off in modern times to Blake Crouch, which I'm sure I'll talk about him at some point. He is amazing. But Michael Crichton was like the original. He's talking about stories where technology runs amok, where amazing things are happening, but we never think about the unintended consequences. Sure, it sounds awesome to bring dinosaurs back, but what could happen that we're not thinking about? You know, the movie deals with that somewhat, but the book deals with it a lot. Now, the interesting thing about this book versus movie discussion is that I love both of them, and that almost never happens. The movie, 90% of the time, is worse than the book and doesn't live up to it and just ends up disappointing you. But Jurassic Park was great as a movie and as a book. And the interesting thing is, I feel like the movie only uses the title of the book and a few of the names of the characters. The plot is almost totally different. So even if you've seen the movie a lot, you could go back and read the book, and it's a totally new experience. It's really good. And it gets into a bunch of interesting things that the movie doesn't touch on. So different characters and different things happen to the characters. You might think certain characters are safe. I wouldn't be so sure. So read the book. It's great. And of course, Michael Crichton, he came out with so many books that were awesome in that same techno thriller genre. One of the other ones that he wrote I really loved was Sphere. I read that as a senior in high school, and that was slightly different from my Jurassic Park experience, because reading Sphere and then watching the movie that came out a year later was totally different. I hated that movie. I was so excited for it because the book was amazing. It was so creepy and interesting and had an ending that was just mind-blowing. I went to the movie with super high expectations, and they were not met. The movie was the movie sucked, but that just goes to show that, you know, sometimes the movies live up to the books and sometimes they don't. All right, so moving along, the next thing I want to talk about is a book that everybody knows because it blew up and sparked the love of an entire generation. Of course, I'm talking about Harry Potter, the one and only, right? J.K. Rowling, she's the best. Now, my experience with Harry Potter was a little bit different maybe from some people, because when Harry Potter originally came out in the United States in 1998, at the time it came out, I was not living in the United States. I was out of the country for 2 whole years, and I had little to no knowledge of anything pop culture related that was going on in the States. Now, when I came back in the year 2000, at that point, the first 4 books had been released. And so I didn't know anything about them. But I had a younger sister who was obsessed with Harry Potter, like most of you back then. And so she introduced it to me. She had the books, and I was like, really? Like, can't be that good, right? But I was like, all right, I'll read it. She wanted me to read it, so I'm like, sure. And so I read the first book, and I mean, the first chapter, I knew that this was something that was special. And of course, went on from there. As soon as I got through the first book, I was like, this is amazing. Like, I don't care if it's for kids, I love it. And so then I just burned through the first 4 books in a row. And then at that point, I was like the rest of you, waiting for the next book to come out, waiting for the 5th and then 6th and 7th books to come out, and witnessing all of the craziness in the bookstores with release nights and all of that kind of stuff. This is my copy, the illustrated by Jim Kay version that they've started to release. I really love these ones. But I'll tell you a funny story about Harry Potter. So I was in the Army. I enlisted and served in the Army for 12 years. Now, the 7th book, when the 7th book came out, I was training in a little Air Force base where there were a bunch of people that were training that, let's say, were in one of the nerdier jobs in the Army, which was me, right? And So a lot of the people that were there, a lot of the soldiers, were interested in Harry Potter. Maybe not something you would assume that a lot of soldiers would be into, but at this base, everybody was into it. And it was a small base, and there was a little mail room, and you would have to go there to get your mail if you had any. And when the seventh Harry Potter book came out, that tiny mail office was flooded with copies of the seventh book. And you know, it's a big one. And there were hundreds of these coming into that poor mail office. And the people that were running it were like, what the heck is going on? What is this? Like, the drill sergeants and people that were there were like, you guys are insane. And so it was kind of funny that all of those soldiers were so into Harry Potter. Harry Potter was important to me because I view that as the moment when my reading to my kids progressed from reading just kids' books to reading full novels. And from that point on, we've continued doing that every night, and it's been awesome and great. And they've loved it so much, and so have I. And so for that reason, Harry Potter will always have a special place in my heart. Now, you've come with me on this journey so far. We've gone a long ways, but I'm going to have to make a command decision and pull the car over. I know dads hate to pull over in the middle of a trip, but this video is getting a little bit long. We're going to call this Volume 1 of the books that made me who I am. Next week, we're going to go to do Volume 2, and I'll move you guys into the 21st century, all the way to modern day. So I appreciate you coming along with me on this journey. Thank you so much for all of your love and support on the channel. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What are the books that made you the men and women who you are today? What are those foundational reads that you couldn't do without and that have turned you into the readers that you are today? Let me know. And next week, we'll go to Volume 2. So until then, don't forget to keep reading to your kids every night. All right, see ya.